to Story Run with Brendan, where I read a story or a poem for you. This time I'll read part 2 of The Adventures of Ralph Rashleigh by James Tucker. This is a story about a convict that came to Australia. In part 1, Ralph was being a crim in Britain. Well, let's continue. Chapter 3. The crushing effect of the shock of his heavy loss, combined with the strain upon his nervous system resulting from his debauch, was that Rashleigh developed severe brain fever. The landlord of the inn found him heavily intoxicated and put him to bed in one of his rooms, first taking his purse and deciding to apportion his charges according to its contents. It was not until the 4th week of his illness that Rashleigh recovered consciousness, and it was some days before he was strong enough to take the air. On inquiring of the landlord for his money, he was presented with a bill which, with the surgeon's charges for visits and medicines, amounted to over £88, and the man demanded discharge of this bill immediately. As he held the money, Rashleigh had no alternative but to settle the bill. Extortionate as he knew the charges to be, all that remained to Rashleigh was the sum of £7 10 shillings and 8pence, and the suit of clothes in which he stood. Wasted in health and strength, preyed upon by remorse and hopelessness, he determined to abandon his life of crime and take up again his occupation as a legal copyist. He left the inn for a small furnished apartment near the temple, and after a week's recuperation, visited an old employer and asked for work. The lawyer received him in a friendly way and promised that he would have some work ready for him the next day, and Rashleigh made his way back to his lodging with an easier mind than he had since he had first begun to utter spurious coins. On his way home, an incident occurred which made mock of his good resolutions and committed him to a terrible future. A man passing in the custody of a police officer on the way to the watch house hailed Rashleigh, who, on turning to look at him, discovered that it was his accomplice in the robbery of the house in Welbeck Street. Suspecting that Rashleigh was the pal of his prisoner, the officer passed the word to one of his colleagues, and in less than a quarter of an hour, Rashleigh found himself arrested and lodged in the watch house, ignorant of the charge upon which he had been arrested. After an anxious night in the cells, he was brought next day before the magistrate of Bow Street to hear the officer charge Thomas Jenkins, alias Thomas Jones, alias Thomas Smith, and a number of other aliases, with having been concerned in a daring robbery of a house in Adelphi. The police case against him was proved to the hilt. It appeared, however, that Jenkins had been seen in the company of an associate on the evening of the robbery, whom the police were prepared to swear greatly resembled Rashleigh. After Jenkins had been committed for trial at the Old Bailey, Rashleigh was put into dock, but the only evidence which could be found against him was of a negative character. He stated with considerable heat that he was not a thief, but a legal copyist. It was decided to remand him for a week, so that inquiries could be made. When he was again brought before the magistrate, he found that his associate in crime, Jenkins, had turned King's evidence against him and had made full confession of his story of the Welbeck Street crime, and had implicated the hackney coachman who had assisted in the removal of the booty, as well as the receiver who had brought it for them. Whatever defence Rashleigh might have been able to put up was destroyed by his inability to explain how he had occupied himself during the previous 18 months. The police had made inquiries and found that his claims to be a copyist were based upon his visit to the lawyer whom he had mentioned on the day of his arrest, and the fact of his imprisonment for uttering spurious coins was put in. Rashleigh was therefore committed to Newgate to take his trial at the ensuing sessions for burglary, which at the time was a capital offence. Strongly secured by leg chains and handcuffs, Rashleigh was hustled into the prison van, with 2 prostitutes committed on the charge of pocket-picking. A girl, fresh from the country, who was committed to prison for having stolen a few articles from her mistress, an apprentice boy charged with robbing his master's till, an old beggar who was to be tried for a street assault, and finally a brutal-looking Irishman who had beaten his wife so severely that her life was despaired of. On the way to the prison, The van was filled with the noise of the wailing of the servant girl, the bawdy cross-chat of the two strumpets, and the wild curses of the Irishman, so that it was a relief to Rashleigh when at last the van stopped outside the prison gates. The van door was thrown open, and its prisoners unloaded by torchlight. Then Rashleigh and the others were hurried through the prison gates to the accompaniment of brutal jeers and jests from the mob which collected nightly to greet the arrival of prisoners. A feeling of icy despair came over him as he heard the grating noise of the hinges and the rasp of the great bolts as the door was closed, shutting him off from the free world, as it seemed, forever. All the prisoners were subjected to a strict search, but all their money and other innocent articles were immediately returned to them. A wardress led the women in one direction, and a turnkey ordered Rashleigh and the other men to follow him along a gloomy passage, the walls of which were festooned with fetters and handcuffs, between which hung firearms of all sizes and dates. The sight of these added to Rashleigh's feeling of dread, but it was the instruments of punishment and torture, some of them then obsolete, which made the most terrifying impact upon his imagination. The passage ended in a small room in which a clerk entered the personal description of each of the criminals, after which they were moved on through a small yard until they were halted by a grated door. After some delay, this was opened, and they were admitted into a new wing of the building, and led up 3 flights of stone stairs into a large, badly lit apartment, the unglazed windows of which were strongly secured by iron bars, except for a rough table and 2 or 3 wooden forms. The room was unfurnished, though scores of prisoners were sitting and lying around its floor. The turnkey handed his batch of prisoners over to the man in charge of the ward, who gave to each of them a chunk of black bread, a length of coconut matting, and a coarse horse rug. On the instant of the door closing upon the turnkey, a rug was flung over Rashleigh's head from behind, and he was pulled to the ground. The same treatment was meted out to all the newcomers, and all were stripped of their clothing by their fellow prisoners. Rashleigh was too dispirited to resist, and when the laughing prisoners had their way with him, he secured his rug and mat, spread them on the ground, and lay naked down to sleep. The combined distractions, however, of the vermin with which the place was overrun, the noisy talk, and other nameless annoyances from the dregs of humanity, who were now his associates, combined with the intense cold and the unease of his mind, made sleep quite impossible. He spent the night tossing and tumbling, brooding remorsefully upon the past, and making golden resolutions for the future. Rising before the majority of his fellow prisoners was stirring, he examined the pile of clothing which he saw lying in the middle of the floor, and finding his own clothes, dressed quickly and went to warm his frozen body by the fire. At 8 o'clock, several buckets of this gruel, which served as breakfast, were brought in, but in spite of the poor quality of the food, Rashleigh made a hearty meal with the gruel and the black bread which had been given him the previous night. After breakfast, the prisoners attended prayers in the chapel, and then those who were so inclined went to wash themselves at the pump. After this, the order of the day seemed to be simply to stand around in the yard, talking and waiting for any messages or parcels which might be brought by friends. Rashleigh stood among the disconsolate group of men who had hoped of neither message nor parcel, and who could only look on in envy at the more fortunate prisoners. His interest was suddenly arrested by the appearance of a man who, in answer to the name of William Tyrrell, 1. Side note. On the 7th day of the 5th sessions at the Old Bailey in 1827, the trial of William Tyrrell took place. The sessions papers gives the following account. William Tyrrell was indicted for a fraud. Samuel Bills, I keep the Blue Post's public house in Holborn, and book for the Kentish town coach. On the 17th of April, the prisoner, who was a stranger to me, came to the office and produced a brown paper parcel, with this ticket to it. Looking at it, the parcel was to be sent to Kentish Town, and the ticket purports to be from the Angel St. Clement's and charges 1 shilling 8 pence carried and 6 pence porterage. It was directed to Mr. Sheen, Kentish Town. He demanded 2 shillings 2 pence, which I paid him. He brought another parcel about 3 o'clock the same afternoon, and had a ticket with that purporting to come from the Angel, and charges 2 shillings 2 pence, which I paid him. Believing to be correct, cross-examined by Mr. Bailey. Question: did you know where they came from? Answer: no. The ticket only denotes that they came from the country. The parcels were found to contain nothing but brown paper. James Phipps says, I am a coachman. I took the parcel to Mr. Sheen of Kentish Town, but it was a hoax. Joseph Werrett said, I took a parcel to Hampstead, but could not find the person it was directed to. Joseph Waters said, I am porter at the Angel, St. Clement's. We often send parcels by the short stages, and a ticket like these, with our charge. Cross-examined by Mr. Barry. Question: is this one of your tickets? Answer: we used these about 2 years ago. The prisoner was employed at the Angel about 4 years ago. Samuel Hobson said, I took the prisoner in charge. He said poverty drove him to it, and that he had a wife and 3 children. I believe he was in great distress. Mr. Barry addressed the court on behalf of the defendant and called several witnesses who gave him a good character. Guilty. Recommended to mercy. Confined 3 months. Back to the main text. So William Tyrrell went forward through the door to the visitor's room. There was something about the man which made Rashleigh think that he had seen him before, and on asking another prisoner who Tyrrell was, he learnt that he was a swindler undergoing a sentence of 3 months' imprisonment. While the inmates broke up into groups and gangs, schools as they were termed, and settled down to various forms of gambling, Rashleigh watched the door through which Tyrrell must return. Without losing sight of the door for more than a few moments, he was able to observe that gaffing, or tossing the halfpenny, was the favourite form of gambling, which, despite the smallness of the unit stake, roused the players to a frenzy of excitement, and was carried on to the accompaniment of such an assortment of language as could only be heard in Billingsgate, Chequer Alley, and Winfried Street. Quarrels occurred, and rings were formed in proper prize-fighting order, and the protagonists, cheered by their seconds, fought the issue to a knockout. Betting was carried on over these battles, and he saw one man pledge his very shirt and shoes in support of his favourite. It astonished Rashleigh that men could keep so free-hearted and careless in such circumstances, when many of them knew that only a miracle could save them from the gallows in a few weeks' time. At last Tyrrell reappeared, and as he passed him, Rashleigh recalled where it was that he had seen him. The occasion had been when Tyrrell was being taken in custody of a constable to Hertford Jail, and Rashleigh had entered the inn at which they were passing the night en route. He had sat in with the policeman, and plied him so generously with liquor that the fellow had fallen into a drunken sleep, whereupon Rashleigh had taken from his pocket the key of the room in which the prisoner was confined, and released him. He had further given him sufficient money with which to make good his flight. Rashleigh went over and talked with Tyrrell, who almost at once recognised him as the man who had so opportunely laid him under an obligation. He asked Rashleigh how he was fixed in prison, and on learning that he was practically penniless and without any influence or friends, Tyrrell at once showed that he was no ingrate. He explained that he had, by dexterous bribing of jail officers, obtained a place in one of the best and most luxurious rooms in the whole prison, where he had every facility for enjoying life, and that he had always all the money he needed. He promised to arrange it that Rashleigh should be removed into this desirable ward, and offered in any case to let him share his mess until the sessions. The principal turnkey of the jail came presently to the yard gate to superintend the distribution of the meat and soup to the prisoners, and Tyrrell seized the opportunity to ask the officer to allow Rashleigh to be transferred to what was known as Smuggler's Ward. The force of his appeal was driven home with a handsome bribe, surreptitiously pressed into the turnkey's hand, and Rashleigh received permission immediately to change his ward. It proved that Tyrrell had not exaggerated the comforts which were to be had in this notorious ward. The beds were all clean looking, and a number of them were screened off separately with coarse curtains, thus dividing the main room into small private apartments, which were actually rented by the wardsmen weekly to those who could afford them. There were decent tables and chairs and other furniture, and generally Rashleigh decided that there were worse places in which to hunt comfort than His Majesty's jail. Tyrrell gave him a share of his own 2-bedded apartment, enclosed like the rest with curtains. It contained several shelves and a table with drawers, all loaded with articles of petty merchandise, which gave it the appearance of a husker's shop. A corner of the cubicle was actually used for the latter purpose, as Rashleigh discovered when, a few minutes after their arrival, several prisoners came to purchase tea, sugar, coffee, milk, eggs, bacon, butter, and other edibles, and the two of them were occupied for more than an hour supplying the customers. His benefactor then ordered a meal to be prepared for them, and Tyrrell, noticing his guest's surprise, explained that Smuggler's Ward kept its own hours and had its own regime of existence, independent of prison routine. It was true, he said, that all had to attend prayers in chapel every morning for half an hour with the ruck of prisoners, but they returned to their beds and remained snugly in them until the ward had been thoroughly cleaned out, their boots and clothes brushed, and their breakfasts cooked by their servants. Every one of the prison haut-ton who could afford the luxury employed a servant, while others, less opulent, clubbed their resources and shared the cost of a servant between them. These servants, Rashleigh discovered, were mostly the Johnny Raws, simple-minded countrymen or young apprentices who had not acquired sufficient guile to supply their wants, and were glad to earn a little cash and extra food by serving the more fortunate prisoners. Chapter 4. Once Rashleigh and his ward mates were locked up for the night, they spent the time much as they would have done in some favourite tavern, drinking, singing, gambling, and tale-telling. Porter was permitted by the regulations, but bribery and corruption made it easy to introduce into the ward all brands of wine and spirits, which, in such circumstances, were drunk to excess whenever the quantity was adequate. Over their liquor, the hardened criminals related their exploits with the pride peculiar to their kind, and the beginners in crime were eager in their initiation, and longed for freedom principally to seek opportunities of equalling or excelling the feats of their hard-drinking preceptors. Raw shop lads, awaiting trial for peculations from their masters' tills, sat at the feet of old offenders and listened agog to the stories of the rich rewards which came from a career of plunder. Decent youngsters were in this fashion easily misguided into desiring a life of lucrative villainy, abandoning forever in their minds any thought of returning to a law-abiding existence. Day followed day, its program unvarying. Attendance at prayers in the morning, hours spent in loitering purposelessly through the day, with songs, yarns, and drinking in the evenings. The approach of the sessions, however, steadied the inmates of Smuggler's Ward. There was much to be done. They had counsel to fee, attorneys to instruct, and defences to draw up. Rashleigh's acquaintance with the law made this occasion one of golden opportunities. He was engaged to write letters, prepare statements, and plot the course of cross-examination of dangerous witnesses. He was well paid for these services, and was able not only to fee counsel for himself, but also to fit himself out in decent clothes in which to attend the approaching trial. He was shrewd enough to realise, however, that his chances of acquittal were practically non-existent. Thomas Jenkins and the hackney coachman who had been concerned with him in the robbery had told stories which were corroborative and conclusive, and he realised that his hopes were further minimised by the fact that the Crown, in finding him guilty, would automatically prove their case against the very troublesome Jewish fence who had received and paid for the stolen plate. The police had for years been waiting for an opportunity to arrest this man, and the establishing of Rashleigh's guilt was all they needed now in order to seize the chance which his accidental arrest had put into their hands. Nevertheless, with the shadowy hope that mocks despair, he prepared his defence with all the skill he had, and waited for the opening of the sessions at which the destinies of 400 unfortunates were to be determined. The dreaded day came when the sessions began, and Rashleigh watched with increasing amazement the light way in which the returning prisoners took their sentences. Scarcely a man showed any sign of regret, remorse, or concern as they came back from their ordeal by trial. Men who had received less than 7 years' transportation were as gleeful as if they had been acquitted, and those who had been sentenced to a flogging jested about the mere teasing which they were to receive from the lash. 7 years' transportation he heard referred to, with a laugh, as a small fine of 84 months, and even those sentenced for 14 years and for life seemed to treat their doom as a jest. Looking on, it made him shudder to hear those who had received the death sentence comment upon their fate as though it were some obscene and brutal joke to look forward to a hanging. The day came when, by the calendar, Rashleigh knew that his turn had come. He turned sick with fear as he found, on examining the list, that several housebreakers were to be tried in sequence on the same day. He waited his turn in a frenzy of despair, as, one after another, his comrades in crime came back, all doomed to death. He could not even pretend to join in the laugh which greeted the sally of one man, that they were selling them all like bloody bollocks to the knackers, meaning to the condemned cell. There had been a dangerous outbreak of burglary in London during the past winter, and it was obvious that the citizens' jurors meant to put a stop to the crime by allowing no suspected offender to escape. At last Rashleigh's turn came to stand in the dock, an amusing spectacle for the crowded spectators, who behaved with scanty consideration for the dignity of the court. The lawyers made a show of examining their briefs, and the trial began. Ralph Rashleigh was indicted by that name for having on a certain day and date set forth in the arrangement, with force and arms, feloniously broken into and entered the dwelling house of Wesley Shortland, Esquire, in the night time, and for having therein stolen, taken, and carried away a large quantity of silver plate, his property, contrary to the statute and against the peace of our sovereign lord the king, his crown and dignity, the indictment being interlarded with a vast number of other legal phrases. To this, of course, he pleaded not guilty, and put himself upon his trial. A jury was now impanelled, and the advocate for the prisoner having declined to challenge any of their number, the case proceeded. The learned counsel for the Crown, after an eloquent exordium, in which he dwelt at great length upon the many daring depredations recently committed under cover of the night upon the properties of the peaceful and well-disposed inhabitants of the town, proceeded to give a sketch of the case in question. As he had been informed, it would be proved in evidence, and he wound up reverting to the skilful and adroit manner in which the robbery had been perpetrated, at the same time charitably requesting the jurymen to dismiss all prejudices from their minds, and try the case solely by the statement of the witnesses. Nevertheless, he gave it as his private opinion that the prisoner at the bar was a scoundrel of the deepest dye, steeped in crime to the very lips. The evidence of Mr. Shortland's butler was now taken, he swore that having obtained his master's permission to pay a visit to a sick friend for a day or two, he had collected the whole of the plate under his care and safely locked the articles in the pantry on the night in question. A female servant next disposed to finding the pantry locked up, but all its valuables contents missing, on the following morning, and the approver then completed the whole case by giving a clear and detailed story of the manner in which the prisoner and himself had actually committed the crime in question. His evidence was sustained by that of the hackney coachman, who had also been admitted to give testimony on the part of the Crown, and though Rashleigh's counsel most cunningly cross-questioned both these witnesses, and elected from Jenkins, in particular, the admission that he had been a thief from his earliest youth, and of having him been actively engaged in the commission of every species of crime during a period of 25 years. Yet the damning fact of the want of any regular or honest mode of livelihood on the part of Rashleigh rendered all efforts abortive, and after a brief pause the jury, without retiring, found Ralph Rashleigh guilty of the crime of burglary. The atmosphere of the court became suddenly tense with morbid expectancy. The dramatic moment had arrived. The recorder addressed the prisoner in a silence broken only by his voice. Ralph did not hear the sentences preambling the words of his doom. Only when the awful formula, "and hanged by the neck until you be dead," was spoken, did he realize that the sentence which he had dreaded had actually been passed upon him. A shiver ran through his frame, and then his consciousness seemed to be drugged. The court became unreal as a scene in a dream. Under the guidance of a warder, he walked like a somnambulist from the dock, scarcely seeing the people on the crowded benches whose eyes preyed upon his misery. Still realization did not come as he meekly followed the warder down the gloomy passage from the sessions hall to the jail yard. He smiled foolishly at Tyrrell when the man asked him what luck he had had, and left it to the turnkey to provide the answer with the word "cells," which he shouted to the officer waiting to receive prisoners sentenced to death. He smiled again at Tyrrell's words of encouragement as his ward-mate shook his hand, and the significance of the small packet which he found himself grasping at the end of the handshake entirely eluded his stunned intelligence. Scarcely knowing that he held the packet, he suffered the turnkey to hurry him along through yards and passages until they reached the great ward, where the condemned men were housed during the day. It was still only the third day of the sessions, yet there were over 40 men, most of them young, already herded together under sentence of death by hanging. They greeted Rashleigh with loud cries of "Fisho! One more in the net!" and asked him what particular crime had been his. "Crack," he replied, bewildered by the high spirits of his questioners. "There's 28 of us now," said one, "all judged for housebreaking." "The scragsman, hangman, will make a rare haul out of us," cried another, a sally which was greeted with roars of laughter, as if to jests about their coming end was to touch the very apex of humour. During the midday meal, Rashleigh sat next one of his late companions in Smuggler's Ward, speculating upon the probable number of those condemned who would actually be hanged. It was well known that after each sessions a certain proportion of the sentences were commuted to transportation, but so haphazard appeared to be the method by which the lucky ones were selected that it was impossible to speculate who among them all would escape hanging. Tales were told of authentic cases in which hardened criminals with a long record of offences were allowed to escape and young thieves were hanged. These stories had the effect of still further depressing Rashleigh, whose anticipations were darkened by complete hopelessness. He managed to keep despair at arm's length during the afternoon by joining in the gambling and signing in which the bolder and less imaginative spirits indulged, and keeping his eyes averted from the spectacle of the few miserable creatures who paced gloomily up and down the ward, muttering and groaning in fear. At night, the prisoners were broken up into threes and led to the dormitories, in which they were to sleep during the short remainder of their lives. The cells were 12 feet by 8, containing 3 rude bedsteads, on each of which were 2 rugs and a straw mattress. It was already dusk, and as no artificial light was provided, Rashleigh and his 2 cellmates lay down to sleep in the falling darkness. It was only now that the awfulness of his position made its full impact upon his imagination, and he hid his head beneath his rugs as if to hide himself from the terrifying thoughts which whirled through his brain. In despair, he began to consider suicide, thinking out one's means after another, yet abandoning them as they occurred to him. Suicide was succeeded by the hope of escaping from the prison, and he revolved the problem in his mind as the peals of a neighbouring clock recurred hour after hour and found him sleepless. This reminder of times passing brought more vividly before him the realization that his hours on earth were actually numbered, unless... Hope leapt in his heart as he remembered that there was a chance, a good chance, he told himself fiercely, of being reprieved and transported. At last he began to sleep fitfully, only to be tormented with dreams more devastating to his peace than his waking terror. He dreamt of a funeral bell tolling for his execution. Accompanied by the priest, he reached the scaffold, ascended to the platform, and saw below and around him the mocking faces of a sea of spectators. He felt the cold, rough, hempen rope touch his neck, felt the anguish of the eternal moment of the drop, and, as in his dream, he struggled against strangulation. The pain was so intense that he awoke to find himself bathed in cold sweat and his limbs numbed. He lay crushed by the dread of the dream, fighting against the thoughts which assailed him, praying for the day to dawn. As soon as he heard sounds of movement in the passage outside, he sprang from his pallet bed and paced the small floor until the turnkey came to lead him and his 2 companions in duress to the day ward. Light of day and the cheerful company of his fellows reassured him. By the time of sessions had ended, there were altogether 65 men in the condemned side, all under sentence of death. At first the days passed in slow monotony, and the nights in terror, akin to that of the first night, but gradually Rashleigh became mentally calloused to the anticipation of the dreaded prospect ahead of him, and began to plan seriously to escape. He discovered that his cell was on the outer wall of Newgate, and broached his scheme to his 2 night companions. One of them was too apathetic and miserable even to want to escape, but the second man was enthusiastic. The 2 of them, therefore, began operations that same night. With the 2 files which had been in the parcel which Tyrrell had pressed into Rashleigh's hand, and a piece of iron about 2 feet long which had once been the handle of a frying pan. This was sharpish at one end and served as a chisel. Choosing a place behind their beds, they began laboriously to scrape the mortar from the joints between the stonework of the wall, carefully connecting the dust into their pockets and throwing it among the ashes of the fire in the morning when they went into the day ward. In 3 nights they had loosened enough stonework for their purpose, but on removing the ashlar blocks they were chagrined to find that there was a timber framing on the outside of the wall. They replaced the stones and made new plans to cope with this new difficulty. Next day they purloined 2 sharp table knives, which they notched into the semblance of saws with their files, and sharpened the teeth as well as they could. Also they bribed a turnkey to procure them a phosphorus box and a piece of candle. On examining the petition next night, they found that it was simply weatherboarding, such as is used to finish the gable ends of a roof. That night they succeeded in their task of cutting away a sufficiently large hole to enable them to crawl out. They found that the hole debouched under the apex of a roof abutting onto the prison, and there was nothing to prevent them climbing through onto the joists of the garret. Once there, they set about removing the tiles from the roof. Freedom already seemed to be theirs when, In his eagerness to reach up, Rashleigh's companion slipped from the joist and crashed through the lath and plaster of the ceiling of the room below. The next thing he knew was that he was sprawling on the bed of an old woman, who had instantly awakened and was shrieking, "Rape! Fire! Murder!" at the pitch of her voice, despite all the efforts of the man to pacify her and explain his intrusion. Rashleigh, motionless as a rock, listened to this and to the sound of hurrying footsteps, which proved that the household had been aroused. Under cover of the noise, he crept over to the hole in the ceiling and peeped through. He saw the door bust open and half a dozen men and women, mostly in night attire, rush into the room. His companion, immediately the door was opened, bolted past his would-be captors and plunged down the stairs. Above the chatter of voices in the room beneath his feet, Rashleigh heard the sound of a struggle on the stairs, and judging from this that his friend had been captured, he thought it best to make his escape onto the roof. Nerved by despair, he tore away battens and tiles and scrambled through the hole he had made. In his panic, he missed his hold on the roof and began to roll at ever-increasing speed down the steep slope. His expectation of sudden and violent death when he should pitch over the roof edge to the ground below was disappointed. The jerk which he was expecting occurred, but instead of dropping through space, he found himself gasping in icy water. He struck out to swim to the edge of this roof reservoir, and clutching the parapet wall, climbed out onto it. The pitchy darkness prevented him from knowing how far from the ground he was, and also made any attempt at exploring the roof extremely perilous. There was nothing for it but to sit where he was astride the wall and wait for dawn. During the hours through which he sat soaked to the skin and almost frozen, Rashleigh had leisure in which to regret ever having attempted to escape. Compared to his predicament, the rough comfort of his prison seemed like luxury. Light came at last, and Rashleigh saw at once that there was small chance of escape. He was on top of a flat, unbroken wall, and the flagged courtyard at its foot was over 40 feet below his perilous perch. His only method of concealment was to jump back into the water, though even there he could be seen from the roof. He was just as securely imprisoned as he would have been in the strongest cell in Newgate. So hopeless was his position that he began almost to hope that someone would see him, and this hope was realized so suddenly that he nearly pitched to the ground with the violence of the start he gave. "Ha, my fine fellow!" cried a gruff voice, and gripping wildly at the wall, Rashleigh looked up and saw a turnkey holding a carbine to his shoulder, sitting at the foot of a chimney stack. "You're there, are you?" taunted the turnkey. "Well, you're safe enough where you are, and we've got your pal too." "Don't shoot me," cried Rashleigh, alarmed at the sight of the unwavering barrel pointing towards him. "You keep still and I won't," rejoined the turnkey, "but move an inch and I'll topper you over full of lead." Someone now observed him from below. A ladder was brought, and descending it, Rashleigh was at once seized and hustled back to prison. After a week on bread and water in a dark cell, he was heavily ironed and allowed to join his fellows in the day ward. The ensuing days passed without incident until one afternoon, during the 5th day after the sessions, the prisoners were taken early to their cells, and the doors closed upon them. In a little while, the sound of cell doors opening and closing, and the voice of the prison chaplain warned the men that the critical hour had come at last. Death or reprieve? Which? This question drummed in the mind of every man. Rashleigh stood, his breath coming quickly, until the cell door opened to admit the sheriff in his official dress and the chaplain in his robes. His breath caused a fluttering sensation in his throat as he listened to the sheriff addressing one of his cellmates. "William Roberts, your case has received His Majesty's most gracious consideration, but your frequent previous convictions and the circumstances of peculiar atrocity with which your last crime was accompanied utterly preclude the possibility of mercy being extended to so hardened a criminal. You must therefore prepare to expiate your offences on the scaffold. You are ordered for execution in 14 days from the present." While the unhappy man struggled against completely breaking down before the irrevocable destruction of his last gleam of hope, the chaplain addressed him with a homily on the need for prayer and repentance, which the fellow seemed not to hear. Rashleigh, fear tightening his heartstrings, watched his rolling eyes and his ineffectual struggle to speak, with a fascination that had no sympathy in it. The dread of the moment for his own fate had stunned all feelings of altruism. He was not kept long in suspense. The sheriff addressed him and his remaining cellmate jointly, pompously announcing that, in the exercise of his royal prerogative of mercy, His Majesty had graciously been pleased to spare their lives, but that to vindicate the insulted laws of his realm, they must prepare themselves to be transported for the remainder of their lives as criminal exiles in a distant land, and never more to set foot upon the soil of England. Another homily from the chaplain, impressing upon the two prisoners the necessity of falling on their knees and giving thanks to God for sparing their most unworthy lives, was interpreted roughly by Rashleigh's companion. "If ever I do pray to God," he said fiercely, all his hate and defiance of society concentrated in his voice, "it will only be to beg that I live to see you hanged, you prayer-mumbling, sanctimonious old swine, taking pleasure at hitting at poor bastards when they're down. Go to hell." The sheriff failed to suppress a smile as he followed the angry cleric out of the cell. Chapter 5. Lags away! This was the cry which, a few nights later, warned the transportees who had been respited that the time had come for them to be taken down to the hulk on the coast, in which they would be confined until the next convict ship was due to sail. Rashleigh and more than 50 other men were crowded into 2 large vans, handcuffed, heavily ironed, and chained together into the van's sides. As soon as all the prisoners were thus properly secured, the vans were driven off at a brisk pace towards an unknown destination. There were several of these convict hulks on the coast, and no hint was given to the prisoners as to which of them they were bound for. Rashleigh, however, recognised through the window familiar places and buildings, and knew that they were driving down the main Portsmouth road. With the needful changing of horses, and by driving continuously, the vans reached the dockyard late on the following afternoon, and the prisoners were at once paraded on a wooden wharf, alongside which lay the gloomy hulk of the old Leviathan. This vessel was an ancient 74, which, after a gallant career in carrying the flag of England over the wide oceans of a navigable world, had come at last to be used for the humiliating service of housing convicts awaiting transportation over those seas. She was stripped and denuded of all that makes for a ship's vanity. 2 masts remained to serve as close props, and on her deck stood a landward conceived shed, which seemed to deride the shreds of dignity which even a hulk retains. The criminals were marched aboard and paraded on the quarter-deck of the desecrated old hooker, mustered and received by the captain. Their prison irons were then removed and handed over to the jail authorities, who departed as the convicts were taken to the forecastle. There every man was forced to strip and to take a thorough bath, after which each was handed out an outfit consisting of coarse grey jacket, waistcoat and trousers, a round-crowned, broad-brimmed felt hat, and a pair of heavily nailed shoes. The hulk's barber then got to work shaving and cropping the poles of every mother's son, effecting in many cases such metamorphoses that Rashleigh was unable to recognise numbers of those who had come aboard with him. Before leaving the forecastle, each man was double ironed and then taken on deck to receive a hammock, 2 blankets, and a straw palliasse. A guard marched the laden and fettered prisoners below decks, where they were greeted with roars of ironic welcome from the convicts already incarcerated there. The lower deck was divided up into divisions by means of iron palisading, with lamps hanging at regular intervals, and these divisions were subdivided by wooden partitions into a score or so of apartments, each of which housed from 15 to 20 convicts. As Rashleigh and his companions were marched past the occupied pens, they were greeted by a chorus of the cry, "New chums! New chums!" and howls of jeering laughter. In a few minutes, all the newcomers were accommodated in their new quarters. Rashleigh got little sleep that first night, being pestered by the silly tricks of the older hands, who delighted in tormenting the raw recruits. He managed to doze towards morning, and awoke to a consciousness of a most pungent and offensive smell. He glanced over the side of his hammock, and saw that most of his penmates were up and gathered round a wooden tub, known as a kid, into which they were dipping spoons. As he realized that it was from the contents of this tub that the disgusting smell came, his messmates told him that this was breakfast, and that he had best hurry if he wished to have any. He was hungry enough, and obeyed the summons with haste. He filled a borrowed tin can with the foul-stenched mess, and took a spoonful. The taste made him splutter, being, if anything, more loathsome than its smell, and he gave up the idea of breakfast forthwith. The ingredients, he was told, were a very coarse barley, and the tough meat, which was the convict's allowance on alternate days, boiled together until it became the malodorous, tacky mess in the tub. The dietary on the hulk, apart from this so-called soup, was a portion of cheese of the maximum indigestibility 3 days per week. On the days when meat was not allowed, breakfast and supper consisted of a pint of coarse barley, plain boiled in water, and in addition each man was given 1 pound of black bread, with a pint of sour vinegar, miscalled table beer. Work of some kind was provided for all the convicts, a certain number being detailed in cleaning the hulk, cooking, and as servants to the officers. The rest were sent each day to labour in the dockyard in gangs. Rashleigh, without any consideration for his fitness for the work, was placed in a timber gang, and found himself yoked with about 20 others to a large truck, each man being attached by a broad hempen band which was fixed over one shoulder and under the opposite arm. The foreman of each gang was a veteran sailor of the Royal Navy. He was apt to visit upon the convicts the same kind of tyranny as he had been subject to from his officers when he had been on shipboard, though his mercy could be purchased by the price of drinks obtainable at the local taps. Rashleigh's ganger was a natural tyrant who delighted in the crippling and injuring of the men in his charge. They were all ignorant of the correct way of handling timber, and he would deliberately compel his gang to proceed so awkwardly that great bulks of timber would crash from the skids and smash a leg or an arm. These injured were carried off to the hospital, where their death or recovery depended upon the whim of the naval surgeon, whose coarse joke was that he was getting terribly out of practice, and the amputation of a few limbs was just the thing he needed to keep him from getting rusty. While Rashleigh was attached to the hulk, scarcely a week passed without some poor devil giving the surgeon the practice he required. Rashleigh, being unused to such heavy manual work, was at once treated as a skulker and a malingerer, and so came in for a double share of oppression. Overstrained, bullied, and more than half-starved, he came to look forward with a feeling of relief to the day when the ship should arrive that was to take him to New South Wales. There was small comfort in this, however, as the vessel had sailed a few days before his reaching the hulk, and another was not expected to leave for 3 months. The terrible strain was too much for his constitution, and he fell ill, and being transferred to the hospital ship, he was prodigally treated with purgatives, bleeding and blisterings, until he was near dead, as a man well could be. The rest, however, despite the vigorous medicinal treatment, benefited him, and he managed to survive by pouring into the urinal the medicines that were given him, and after some weeks graduated to the convalescent ward. One day 3 patients died, and Rashleigh was one of the gang of convalescent convicts chosen to form the burial party over on the Gosport side, in a graveyard known as Rat's Castle. When the grave had been dug, the guard waved a signal, and the gang sat around among the unnamed mounds, which were the graves of convicts, awaiting the coming of the boat to take them back. Rashleigh fell into a mood of profound melancholy, when suddenly the idea of escape flashed through his mind. In a glance, he took in the fact that the guard was some distance away with his back turned, that the boat had not yet left the side of the hospital ship, and that most of his fellow convicts were asleep on the ground. 10 yards away were the ruins, affording a fine screen from observation, and beyond them the water. It might be done. The irons had been struck from one leg while he was ill, the chains being attached to one side only, so that there was a good chance that he could swim in spite of them. As the weather was warm, about a mile up the shore was a thicket of osiers in which he could conceal himself while endeavouring to remove his irons. Not giving himself time to hesitate, he slipped across to the ruins, dodged through them, flung off what clothing he could, and slipped silently into the stream, swimming away softly. No sound of alarm came, and he proceeded painfully but surely, swimming, wading, and floating, until he reached the osiers, where he found a small creek, up which he swam until he came to a thickly wooded spot. He scrambled ashore and sat down for a while in hiding to recover his spent strength. Urged by the imperativeness of putting as wide a distance as possible quickly between him and the hated hulk, he set to work to try to wiggle himself out of his irons. It was painful, galling work, but owing to his emaciation, he managed at last to slip the fetter from his raw and bleeding ankle. He threw the fetter and his trousers into the deep water and swam across the river, making towards a pile of buildings which he could just make out at a short distance in the gathering dusk. He found that they were cattle sheds, but there was no house near, and in any case he was unwilling to encounter anybody in his state of complete nakedness. He decided to put in his night among the cattle. He made a deep pile of some litter, and burrowing his way into the centre of it for warmth, went to sleep until dawn. He was awakened by a boy coming to turn out the cattle. By the time he had thoroughly realized where he was, the lad had got some distance from the sheds. Rashleigh yelled to him, and the boy came up to him, gaping with astonishment. Rashleigh told him the story that he was a poor sailor who, having got drunk the previous night and lain down by the waterside, had awakened to find himself stripped of all his clothes, and he begged the lad with great earnestness to find him some sort of clothes with which to cover himself until he could get to Portsmouth. The boy promised to do the best he could and set off for his master's house, returning in about an hour with a blue smock and checkered shirt and a waggoner's hat and a pair of cord breeches and low shoes. They were all old and worn, but clean enough, and when Rashleigh had put them on, the boy told him that he could go up to the house, where he might get something to eat if he were hungry. Rashleigh thanked him and asked the way to the house, saying that he would go and wash himself in the river and follow when he was ready. In a few minutes he had thoroughly cleaned himself and prepared to face life anew in the guise of a country bumpkin. Hungry as he was, he thought it might be indiscreet to take advantage of the hospitality suggested by the boy, as his main concern was to increase the distance between himself and the hulk. He therefore set off at a brisk pace along the stream, but after going about a mile, he heard a woman's voice hailing him. "Hi, Thomas, Isaiah." At first Rashleigh did not realise that the woman was hailing him, but after walking on for a while, he heard the voice close behind him roar out, "Darnley, Thomas, stop, Isaiah." At this he turned suddenly and found himself fronting a pretty country girl of about 16 or 17 years of age. He was very much out of breath, and for some moments stood gaping with astonishment at finding herself with a stranger. "Why," she stammered, "thee bain't Thomas arter all." "No, I am not Thomas, my pretty dear," agreed Rashleigh, "but I would be just as willing as he could possibly be to do anything to oblige you." The girl was staring intently at the clothes which Rashleigh was wearing. "Drat it, this be so like our Thomas's slop, why, I could almost hath sworn to it by the patch on the back." "And very likely," replied Rashleigh, "it probably was your Thomas's slop, for it was given to me about a mile back by a boy after I had been robbed of all my clothes." "What? Robbed of your clothes? All of 'em?" cried the girl, shocked. "And did 'em leave thee quite naked?" "They did so," answered Rashleigh, "and I have got a very long way to go without a penny to help myself." "Poor fellow," said the country girl, "if thee'd care to come back again a bit, mother'll give you summat to eat, and thee looks as if thee'd be the better for that." Rashleigh decided that it was, after all, worth the risk, and he went with the girl to the cottage in which she lived with her mother, who listened with sympathy to the story of his night of misadventure while she prepared a substantial breakfast of bread, bacon, and small beer. As soon as he was done, Rashleigh pleaded his need of haste and set off at once in the direction of Winchester, and on Portsdown Heath he overtook a pedlar who was burdened with a heavy bundle in addition to his pack. Rashleigh, adopting a country dialect, fell in with the man, who, finding that their destinations were in a similar direction, offered Rashleigh a shilling if he would carry the bundle for him to the end of the day. Rashleigh, being penniless, was only too glad to avail himself of the offer, and accompanied the man until evening, when he received his shilling, and the two of them went into the village inn for a bite of supper. None of the company took any notice of Rashleigh as he entered, and having eaten his bread and cheese, he sat quietly in a corner, slowly drinking his beer. He was on the point of dozing off, when suddenly the inn door was flung open, and a file of soldiers marched in and guarded both doors. The sergeant in charge of them then walked round the room, intently examining every one in the bar. Rashleigh had taken off his hat, and his close-cropped hair immediately caught the sergeant's attention, and he asked Rashleigh his name. "Thomas Harper," he lied. "What are you?" "A labouring man." "Where do you come from?" "Havant." "Oh, do you?" said the soldier. "And when were you there last?" "A week ago." "Humph, a week ago." "And where have you been since?" pursued the sergeant remorselessly. "Why, at Portsmouth, if you must know," replied Rashleigh, who was beginning to lose his temper at the pertinacity of his questioner, who now drew his sword. "Yes, at Portsmouth, that is true. Anyhow, I know that because you listed there." "Me listed?" cried Ralph haughtily. "No, indeed, I did not, my good fellow." "Ha ha, my country labourer," said the sergeant with a laugh. "Who ever heard of a countryman from Havant talk in a towny tongue like that?" Rashleigh cursed himself for a fool for allowing his anger to overcome his discretion, so that he spoke in his normal London accent. "No, no, my fine shaver," continued the sergeant. "You never came from Havant, and now I have got you. I'll take good care you don't go there neither." At this he gave a sign to two of his men, who seized Rashleigh and secured him with a pair of handcuffs, whereupon a whole party went outside the inn. They took possession of a hayloft, and had supper brought to them, after which Rashleigh was secured to two of the soldiers by handcuffs, and the three of them lay together in the hay to sleep. Rashleigh was more annoyed than perturbed at the predicament in which he had been placed, because he felt confident that the mistake of arresting him as a deserter must be discovered immediately when he came up for examination. They breakfasted at a very early hour the next morning, and immediately set off to march to Portsmouth. The sergeant walked alongside Rashleigh, and taunted him with his folly in trying to impose upon an old soldier by endeavouring to pass himself off as a countryman. Rashleigh answered shortly that they would soon find out their mistake. "Why then," jeered the sergeant, "I suppose you are some king's son in disguise. Well, next time you desert from the army, I would advise you to buy yourself a wig, for it was the cut of your hair that gave you away." Infuriated by this reminder of his stupidity in having removed his hat the previous night, and by the sergeant's sarcasm, he replied haughtily that he was no deserter and he had never enlisted in his life, and expressed the opinion that the life of a dog was better than that of a soldier, and for his own part he would rather turn a nightman than enlist. The sergeant flew into a rage at this insulting remark, and threatened to knock Rashleigh's teeth down his throat if he said another word, and for the remainder of the journey the guard joined the sergeant in baiting the prisoner. They reached the lines of Portsmouth in the evening, and Rashleigh was confined for the night in the guard room. Next morning he was removed to Gosport barracks, where, as he had predicted, it was quickly discovered that he was not the deserter in whose pursuit the party had been dispatched, and the sergeant received a sound rating for his stupidity in arresting the wrong man. He was immediately set at liberty, but he had the misfortune to encounter the sergeant as he was crossing the barrack square. Rashleigh was so elated at his escape that he could not resist the chance of abusing the man roundly for the oppression which he had heaped upon him on the trip to Portsmouth. The sergeant saw the opportunity for avenging the insult to his dignity, roared for the guard, and gave Rashleigh in charge for abusing him while on duty. He was handcuffed and confined to the watch-house, and in the evening was brought before the Mayor of Portsmouth. His concocted story of who he was and how he came to be dressed in the clothes of a country labourer failed properly to convince either the Mayor or the clerk of the bench, who called the sergeant to state his case. The complaint lost nothing in its voluble telling, and concluded with a statement that the prisoner had threatened to kill the witness. "Upon my word," said the magistrate, glaring at Rashleigh, "a very pretty fellow to abuse the honourable profession of a soldier, who spends his life fighting for his king and country, while such rapscallions as you skulk through that same country, looking for opportunities to rob their neighbour's hen roost. Come, what have you to say for yourself, you blackguard?" Rashleigh's reply was to the effect that the witness had greatly exaggerated his offence, that he had not threatened the man's life, but had only reproached him for the harshness with which he had been treated while a prisoner under his charge. 2 or 3 of the sergeant's comrades in arms thereupon stepped forward, offering to corroborate the accusations against the prisoner, but the Mayor, having intimated that he would not trouble them when the case was so obviously established, addressed Rashleigh. "Now, my fine fellow," he said sarcastically, "you thought to oppose upon this court with your lying story. Well, this is the way we deal with such insufferable scamps as you. You can go to jail for a month as a rogue and vagabond who has failed to give a proper account of himself by any manner of means. But I won't give you that light sentence. I'll remand you for a week as a suspicious character, and I have little doubt that before the week has passed we shall have the hue and cry after you for some villainous depredation. Take him away." As he was being taken from the Mayor's court, he saw one of the guards of the Leviathan standing by, probably waiting to report the escape of a convict. This man immediately walked up to Rashleigh and scrutinised him carefully, snatching off the waggoner's hat. "Aha, my pretty spoken gentleman," he cried, recognising him at once. "So you are nabbed already, are you?" In a few moments Rashleigh stood again before the Mayor, who heard with obvious delight the true identity of the fellow whom he had so shrewdly suspected. Knowing well how escaping convicts were dealt with on recapture, he was content to hand Rashleigh over to the Hulk authorities for punishment. Strongly ironed and chained, he was now removed to the Hulk with a pistol barrel pressed against his temple, and was at once confined in a dungeon known as the Black Hole, situated in the ship's eyes below water level, and left there solitary, except for the company of droves of rats, without food, The tedious hours wore horribly away, and in the utter darkness he only learnt that the day had dawned through the sound of tramping feet on deck as the convicts set off to work. It was some hours after this before his prison door was opened by the guard, who took him up to the quarter-deck. Here, impressive and terrifying in their full-dress uniforms, were assembled the captain, his mate, the surgeon, and other officers of the Leviathan. After a very brief trial, in which he could offer only the natural love of liberty as defence, he was sentenced to receive 10 dozen lashes, in the presence of all the convicts that same day. He spent the day until sunset in the black hole, and was then led up to the quarter-deck, passing between the lines of convicts who had been paraded to witness his punishment. The formality of reading over his offence and sentence was quickly performed, and the convict was ordered to strip. Naked, he was securely bound to the gratings, which had been lashed to the bulwarks, and a powerful boatswain's mate stood ready with the lash. Rashleigh had been warned by other victims of the lash that shrieking and writhing only added to the pain, so whilst he was being secured to the grating, he had caught his shirt in his teeth like a gag, so that he could not so much as whisper. The first dozen strokes from the knotted raw hide lash were like jagged wire tearing furrows in his flesh, and the second dozen seemed like the filling of the furrows with molten lead, burning like fire into the raw flesh. These two sensations of intense and intolerable pain alternated until the first 4 dozen, each of which was laid on by a separate seaman with a fresh lash, had been applied, after which his whole body seemed numbed, and the feeling during the remaining 6 dozen was curiously as though his lacerated and bloody back was receiving heavy thuds from great clubs. The flogging endured for longer than an hour, and when he was unbound, he collapsed insensible onto the deck, whence he was borne to the hospital ship. Resuscitation was effected brutally, and he came to his senses screaming with the pain inflicted by the salt dressing which had immediately been applied to his unsightly back. The pain caused by this rudimentary treatment was infinitely worse than anything he had felt during the actual flogging, so that he was nigh driven out of his mind by the stabbing, gnawing horrors of the action of the salt upon his wounds. He cursed and roared under the treatment, which was repeated every day as each new dressing was applied, though it was the rough stripping of the old ones from the festering back that gave Rashleigh a never-fading memory of the torture of being flayed alive. Some tough qualities of constitution and spirit, however, brought him through his continuous ordeal, and after a month or so he was convalescent, recovering just in time to join a draft of convicts for New South Wales by the good ship Magnet of London, Captain James Baltrop. A vessel named Magnet conveyed dispatches from Governor Darling and the Colonial Office for several years at this period. Chapter 6. Washed, shaved, close-cropped, supplied with 2 new suits each, and newly double-ironed, the convicts selected for the draft were paraded aboard the Leviathan for examination by the surgeon superintendent of the Magnet. The few sickly men were ejected and their places filled by robuster transportees, and the approved men were marched aboard a large lighter and transferred to that vessel, swinging at anchor in Spithead. Despite the harshness of the conditions to which he knew that he was going, Rashleigh carried his heavy irons with a light heart, and watched the distance between the hulk and the lighter increase with a feeling of vast relief. The prisoners were immediately taken between decks to their sleeping quarters, where each was given a numbered bed and a blanket, and left for the night. The good ship Magnet was about 500 tons burthen. The greater part of the main deck was relegated to the use of the convicts, who numbered 150, and the deck was divided into 2 sections by a strong bulkhead, the smaller section being for the confinement of the 30 boy convicts who were aboard. The hatchways were secured with elm stanchions in a stout framing, of which all the exposed woodwork was covered closely with broad-headed nails, so that the structure was practically proof against being cut. In one of these hatchways between the men's and the boys' prisons were communicating doors, so small that only one man at a time could pass through them. A military sentry was posted day and night in the hatchway to deal with any attempt at mutiny or other dangerous conduct. The military guard consisted of 2 commissioned officers, 6 NCOs, and 40 private soldiers, some of whom were accompanied by their wives and families. The routine of the ship was arranged so that during the voyage the convicts were allowed the liberty of the deck from sunrise until sunset, under an armed guard of 3 soldiers posted at points of vantage which gave them full surveillance of the tough bunch of derelicts in their charge. A boatswain and 6 mates were selected by the surgeon superintendent from among the convicts, and they were made responsible for the cleanliness and orderliness of their fellows. The convicts' food ration was what was known in the transport service as 6 upon 4, 6 convicts sharing between them the rations normally allowed for 4 Royal Navy sailors. The food was mainly salt tack, and on alternate days a small portion of wine or lime juice was issued. Water was the only item of diet which had to be carefully apportioned. The food, such as it was plentiful. In addition to the surgeon's sanitary party selected from the prisoners, there were also chosen another boatswain, 2 cooks, and other servants, who formed monitors or leaders of the squads of 8 into which, for purposes of food supplies, the convicts were divided. During the few days when the ship lay to in Spithead before sailing, Rashleigh was tempted by the sense of irrevocableness of his departure from England, to do as his comrades were mostly doing, and write to let his connections know of his fate. His better instincts overcame this sentimental urging, and he determined to fade out of their knowledge, lost to them forever in his degradation. Under his assumed name, bumboats, carrying all manner of supplies, hovered daily round the Magnet, and Rashleigh's slender store of money was soon expended on modest supplies of tea, sugar, and other trifling comforts for the long voyage. Although he was, in a sense, glad to be leaving England, he was affected strongly by the good fortune of some of the men whose mothers, wives, sweethearts, and children came on board to take farewell of their menfolk. His own friendlessness contrasted with this affection, sorrow-ridden as it was, made him feel more than ever a pariah, one who had been driven out of the herd, absolutely forever. He was glad when the period of waiting was over, to see the anchor weighed, the sails unfurled, and belly to the breeze, and to feel the slight motion of the ship as she slipped jauntily between the mainland and the Isle of Wight. As night fell on the English Channel, the convicts were ordered below to the sleeping berths between decks. These were framed of deal boards, supported by stanchions and quarterings, and some divided in compartments, each sleeping 6 men in very close proximity. These sleeping berths were framed in rows along each side of the ship, with a double row between them, separated by narrow passages. Rashleigh, being a good sailor, enjoyed what amusement could be got from the conduct of those who were unused to the motion of the ship. Many of them had never been to sea, and the vertiginous motion of the vessel, caused by the broken sea of the Channel, filled them not only with nausea, but with terror. Soon after being shut below, the sea freshened, and at first there was much confusion among the closely packed prisoners. Those who were not too terrified to do other than lie in the immobility of fear, filled the night with a contrasting chorus of oaths and prayers. Gradually, however, a semblance of quietude came, and Rashleigh went to sleep. But as he was lying athwart the ship, and she started rolling, his rest was continually broken by the violent motion. The increasing seas at last made sleep impossible, and he sat up for greater comfort, listening with awe to the crash of the waves against the bows, and feeling the shiver that ran through the ship at each thudding impact. Suddenly the Magnet hit a really big sea with a crash that made Rashleigh instinctively shrink back. There was a scatter noise of timbers falling overhead as a great wave broke over the ship and poured a volume of water down the main hatchway, carrying the sentry violently against the bulkhead and filling the prisoners' berths feet deep. Over 100 sleepers awakened in the unfamiliar surroundings to find their beds awash with sea-water, let loose of pandemonium of terrified cries. The water, as the ship rolled, half drowned first one row of men and then the other. The cry went up that the ship was sinking, and panic took possession of the convicts. Rashleigh looked on in a state of terror, knowing there was nothing to be done, even when a few of the bolder spirits rushed at the small doorway in the hope of breaking through and gaining the deck. He made no move to join them. Their efforts to break through the wicket were in any case unavailing. An officer came with the assurance that there was no danger, leaving the prisoners to pass the remainder of the night, comforted by the news that the big crash had been caused by one of the yards giving way. As most of the convicts knew of no yard except a measure, they were none the wiser for this explanation. Next morning the pumps were got to work and everything made ship-shape. Fair weather favoured the Magnet thereafter, and the equator was reached without any incident occurring to interrupt the strict routine on shipboard. There was a good deal of fun in the ceremony of crossing the line, about 50 of the prisoners being ducked and shaved in tribute to Father Neptune. Rashleigh, because of his clerky education and capacity, had been selected by the surgeon superintendent to act as his clerk, a position which provided him with many comforts, and happened also to prevent him being implicated in a daring scheme which was set afoot by the seizing of the vessel. The boys' prison was separated from the sleeping quarters of the military only by the bulkhead, as it was from the senior convicts' quarters on the opposite side. Some of the irrepressible young thieves had succeeded in loosening a board in the bulkhead, giving them access to the soldiers' quarters. It became known to the men that one of the smallest built lads made a practice of slipping through the narrow space and stealing tea, sugar, tobacco, biscuits, and anything else he could lay hands on. And some of the wilder spirits saw in this a chance to carry out a plot for successful mutiny. They persuaded the boy that he should, on a chosen night, steal 3 muskets which, he said, stood in a rack in the soldier's berth, and which were supposed to be kept continually loaded. The plot was that, the muskets thus secured, they should be passed through into the men's prison, and in the morning, when the convicts were let up to wash the deck, some of those who were up first should go to the fore hatch and receive the stolen muskets from those in the prison below. During the proceeding, the other men on deck were to be very active in throwing water and generally bustling to and fro to attract the attention of the 3 sentries, one at the forecastle, one at the waist, and the third at the poop, of whom only the last would be armed. The 2 sentries forward were to be surprised, seized, and thrown overboard, while at the same signal the one on the poop was to be shot dead. A party would then cut loose the breeching of a loaded cannon on the deck and run it to the companion ladder leading to the soldiers' quarters. Simultaneously, another party was to rush aft and secure the officers. The day came, and to the point of seizing the forward sentries and covering of the sentry on the poop, everything went according to plan, after which everything went to pieces. The stolen muskets proved to be unprimed. The sentry on the poop gave the call to arms, fired his piece at random, and was immediately thrown overboard. The fastenings of the cannon were too tough for the crude implements which the convicts possessed, and they were unable to cut it loose, no one having a knife. By this time the soldiers were pouring up the companion ladder, only to be knocked backwards by the clubbed muskets in the hands of the now desperate prisoners. 2 commissioned officers clambered through the cabin skylight, gained the poop, and shot out of hand two of the boldest among the convicts. This sudden turn in affairs cowed the others, who fell back, giving the soldiers the opportunity to gain the deck. Instantly, a volley of musketry poured into the ranks of the prisoners, of whom 5 fell dead. 3 jumped overboard, and the rest were driven below by the pricking bayonets of the infuriated guards. The whole of that day they spent without food below, and on the following morning they were mustered early on deck. All ranks of the military were under arms, one line being formed across the poop and another across the forecastle, while a gun had been lashed in front of each, beside which stood a seaman with lighted match. Both muzzles were trained upon the main hatchway, where the convicts huddled in a cowering group. Thoroughly abashed by the formidable precautions against any renewed attempt at mutiny, the ship's boatswain called each convict by name, and as each answered, he was ordered up to the quarterdeck, on which the ship's and military officers were assembled in all the impressiveness of full uniform. The only one of the 3 sentries who had escaped death on the previous day was called upon to scrutinize each man as he came forward, with a view to identifying those who had been on deck during the attempted seizure, and each prisoner was stripped. If no wound showed, and the sentry failed to identify the man as a participant in the mutiny, he was interrogated as to his knowledge of the details of the plot, and to the identity of the ringleaders responsible for the outbreak, and promised reward for accurate information, being immediate benefits for the rest of the voyage, and a strong recommendation from the senior officer and the ship's master for his liberty on landing at Port Jackson. Rashleigh, being inveterate and well known, lay abed, who was never on deck in the morning until driven there by compulsion, combined with the fact that his position of clerk to the surgeon made it unlikely that the leaders of the mutiny would have confided their plans to him, was dismissed as innocent of complicity. In the end, about 20 prisoners were specifically identified, and after a severe public flogging were heavily ironed and confined in a den under the forecastle for the remainder of the voyage. No amount of questioning produced any reliable information as to who the leaders had been, and the inquiry closed on the assumption that they were the men who had been shot dead, and those who had jumped overboard at the failure of the attempted seizure. The normal routine, varied only by the posting of 5 sentries on deck instead of 3, was resumed, and no untoward incident occurred until a few days after the Magnet had passed the island of St. Peter and St. Paul. One day a sail was reported standing on a course which would bring her close across the Magnet's course. She was a long, low schooner with raking masts, and in the captain's phrase, she loomed very suspicious altogether. But as she veered onto another course when almost within hail and made away, no further interest was taken in her that day. In the dense haze of the following morning, however, she suddenly appeared close to the Magnet, and almost at the moment she was seen by the lookout man. The sullen roar of a heavy gun boomed across the morning quiet. Before the reverberations of the report had ceased, someone hailed the convict ship in a foreign tongue. Captain Baltrop replied at once. An English convict ship bound for Portsmouth to New South Wales. The excitement promised by the gun's fire had roused even Rashleigh from his bed, and he came up on deck at a run. There he saw the schooner lying with flapping sails, head to wind, and the officers of the Magnet, including the military, gathered on the poop. From the answering hail from the schooner, it was patent that she was a foreigner whose officers knew no English, and immediate confirmation of the conjecture came with a running up of the gaudy flag of Portugal on the stranger's gaff, simultaneously with the firing of another gun. "By hell, that gun was shotted," roared the mate, looking aloft as if following the flight of the ball. "Then, Captain," said the senior army officer, "it's about time we got busy." "Aye, aye, sir," answered Baltrop eagerly. "We'll soon test the stuff she's made of. Hoist away the Union Jack there, Mr. Trays. Jump below and hand up cartridges and wads. Surgeon, will you turn out all your men from below to help load, and run the guns in and out. You at the helm there," he roared. "Bring the starboard side to bear. By the Lord, you can have all the fighting you want, my pup of the Portuguese. Amid the exciting bustle which ensued, Dr. Delmore, a Scottish Presbyterian chaplain who was on board, approached Captain Baltrop. "Do you mean to fight then, Captain?" he asked in terrified voice. "Do I mean to fight?" cried the seasoned sea dog. "Do I mean? Well, that's a good un. Aye, and fight like hell. Do you suppose I'm going to stand by and see my ship plundered, and that glorious bit of bunting overhead insulted by a damned Portuguese? No, Jimmy Baltrop, with 40 soldiers and that mob of toughings, English and fighters, every one of them, to back him, is ready to fight your devil himself, though he rise from the ocean with 7 heads and 70 horns, like your beast in the Revelations. Now stand back out of the way." The parson retreated below before this torrent of bellicose oratory, and the poop was cleared for action. The captain was in great glee and roared with laughter at the spectacle of the clumsy soldiers struggling up to the fighting tops to which they had been detailed. Meanwhile, a boat had been lowered from the schooner, apparently full of armed men, and made towards the Magnet. As it approached, however, the sight of the military guard at their various posts put consternation into the voice of the boat's commander. "Prisoners, prisoners," he shouted back to his ship, and immediately ordered the boat to be put about. He and his crew clambered quickly aboard. The boat was raised, and the schooner stood away without any further warlike action, and made its escape, much to the secret disappointment of every one except the chaplain on board the convict ship. After the excitement of the mutiny and the encounter with the Portuguese, the eventlessness of the remainder of the voyage gave a new dreariness to life aboard, and there was not a man who did not thrill with anticipation when one evening the hail of "Land ho!" from the masthead heralded the end of the sea journey. Chapter 7. In the early hours of the morning, the lights of Port Jackson were seen pricking the darkness, and as day dawned, the Magnet entered the heads, the 2 bold precipitous rocks which guard the entrance of one of the finest harbours in the world. A pilot had come aboard and took charge during the last lap of 7 miles from the entrance to the site of the embryo town of Sydney. Rashleigh stood on deck watching the land in which he was to live for the rest of his life appear on the horizon, and at this first gaze he found it forbidding. Without charm or beauty, sandy bays fringed with stunted trees opened far inland between harsh rocky headlands, with dense forests of gloomy green covering the background. It appeared as a primeval, uncultivated region, bare of any evidence of the softer, tamer results of the work of man for which he and his comrades longed. Even the Golden Island, to which someone called his attention, added to his sense of disillusion, for it appeared in the grey dawn light as a sterile tract of rugged grey rocks, covered at the top with trees of dull green in which was no beauty. The Magnet rounded the last promontory and came into view of the embattled fort at the entrance to Sydney Cove, and the straggling row of cottages which stretched along the high ground. This was a part of the town of Sydney known as the Rocks. Shortly afterwards, the vessel came to anchor at a point opposite a neck of land, from which the whole town was visible. It was an unpretentious specimen of civilization in the raw. Narrow, straggling streets, lined with one-storey houses, scarcely more than large huts, with half a dozen decent residences, and a few miserable cottages appearing through the trees of the north shore of the harbour. Such was the town of Sydney then. There was not a patch of cultivated land to be seen from the ship, even thus close inshore. The day following their arrival, the Colonial Secretary, the Chief Superintendent of Convicts, and other officials came on board to deal with the newly arrived contingent of prisoners. Each man was called into the cabin with full particulars taken of their names, ages, religions, birthplaces, trades, and so on, all of which were entered in a register, with a minute description of each man. When this ceremony was concluded, the officials departed, and a more general class of visitors were allowed on board, some just curious for news of the old country, some to greet expected relatives, and some to inquire whether there were men who practised trades in which labour was required. Among the last was an elderly gentleman who was seeking a suitable assistant for his teaching academy, to whom Rashleigh was recommended by the surgeon superintendent, in whose cabin he was then actually at work. He was called out and presented to the schoolmaster, who, satisfying himself as to Rashleigh's capacity, departed without any definite decision being come to. For 2 weeks the prisoners kicked their heels in the confinement of the Magnet before they were paraded preparatory to going ashore. A new suit of clothing was handed out to each man, and they were broken up into divisions and rowed ashore to a spot near Fort Macquarie, whence they were marched through the domain to the prisoners' barracks, and after a formal parade were dismissed. Numbers of the older prisoners now joined the new chums, bargaining for clothes, trinkets, and other small property, and many of the newcomers found themselves dexterously robbed before bedtime, by men whose criminal agility had not been lessened by punishment. 4 days after his arrival at barracks, only Rashleigh and 2 others remained of the 140 who had reached the colony with him. Those who were masters of trades had been assigned to various masters in need of workmen, and such as had no special training or aptitude were sent to the interior to be employed upon timber felling and agriculture. Rashleigh was equally assigned to the schoolmaster, and in a few days discovered that his billet was in the nature of a sinecure. His employer made no real demands for industry upon either his assistant or the scholars of his so-called classical and commercial academy, and was apt on any excuse to leave Rashleigh in sole charge whilst he indulged himself in whatever amusement was to be had in the town. The improvement in his environment and the conditions of his life had the effect upon Rashleigh of making his consciousness of being a life convict dwindle. He was now respectably clad, and had all the liberty he wanted out of school hours, and quickly drifted back into the kind of leisured existence he had pursued when Hartop had helped him on to the criminal road. He made the acquaintance of other educated convicts, mostly employed in government offices, who had formed the habit of meeting in the evenings in a kind of convivial political club. They debated affairs of state with easy condemnation of the powers that were, and the view that the welfare of the colony was shamefully neglected by government was universally held, and inspired most of the speeches. The extremeness of the views expressed resulted eventually in their meetings becoming of interest to the Sydney police. Rashleigh was one evening riding the full flood of his impassioned eloquence upon the delinquencies of the government, and roundly condemning the harshness of Governor Darling's rule, when 6 constables in charge of a police officer joined his audience. The officer took the names, addresses, and other particulars of everyone present, paying special attention to the man whose indiscreet speech had been cut short in the middle by the police intervention. No steps beyond this examination were taken that night, but the implicit warning was not lost upon Rashleigh, who abandoned foregathering with the embryonic political agitators forthwith. This meant cutting himself away from the only congenial society that was available, for the lower class of the population of the town were of so degraded a type that the solitude of his own companionship was preferable to their company. The small class to which Rashleigh temporarily belonged was sandwiched between 2 main sections of the community, one comprising high government officials and the few large merchants, the then aristocracy of Australia, and the lower social dregs of the convicts, or, as they were officially known, prisoners of the Crown. Many of these had served their sentences, and had established themselves successfully in business of various descriptions, amassing wealth which they mostly used for the indulgence of the weaker appetites of the criminal type. Many of these men had made their fortunes by trading in rum and tobacco with the convict population, and their business morality was as loose as could be, stopping only at practices which would put them back to their former convict status. So Rashleigh was lonely, being denied the company of any women of decent rank by his position as a convict, and he was too fastidious to purchase the use and company of such frailer members of the sex as were upon to sell themselves and their companionship for a consideration. The pretty ladies of Sydney in those days were the very dregs of their outlawed class, wallowing in indescribable sloths of debasement and debauchery, preying upon the desires of debased and despairing men. Rashleigh's period as a respectable living being, to all intents and purposes, in the enjoyment of his freedom, came to a drastic close about a month after the police had interrupted his speech to the political malcontents. One day a constable came to the school with an order signed by the chief superintendent of convicts that one Ralph Rashleigh should accompany the bearer to Hyde Park Barracks. On reaching the barracks, he was placed in strict and solitary confinement, and before sunrise next day he was handcuffed and dispatched with a messenger guard to a government agricultural establishment at Emu Plains, about 35 miles inland. He was not permitted to visit the school to obtain his belongings, the messenger proving impervious to entreaties and bribes. He was compelled to take the long tramp as he was, in a thin suit and a light pair of shoes, which were in tatters long before he reached Parramatta, the end of his first day's stage. Next day he was obliged to walk the remaining 20 miles, barefooted, over the roughest roads, so that his feet were cut and bleeding before he reached his destination. This agricultural establishment employed at various times between 70 and 140 convicts. In an official return dated April 1st, 1827, the number is given as 134. Another dated February 16, 1829, as 6 overseers, 10 mechanics, and 49 labourers. That was part 2 of the story, The Adventures of Ralph Rashleigh by James Tucker. Pretty rough lot in life he had. I wonder how much he exaggerated things, or the editors in the 1950s tweaked the wording. In any case, I'll say goodbye now. Until next time, I wish you well.